Well, good morning. Welcome, everybody, and aloha from Hawaii. Welcome to the UN Global Compact Uniting Business Live 2020. My name is Amanda Ellis, and I'm your moderator for today's important session, Carbon Drawdown, the trillion-dollar opportunity and material concern for boards. I lead global partnerships at the exciting new Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. ASU is the top-ranked university in the US for innovation for the last 6 years in a row, with Stanford at number 2 and MIT at number 3. ASU is also the number 1 university in the US for impact for the Sustainable Development Goals. We are delighted to partner with global innovator and leader for both the SDGs and ESG, environment, social, governance, in education for board members and for senior management, competent boards. CEO Hella Bank-Jorgensen, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. Innovation, partnership, and collaboration for positive impact are also values, of course, held by the UN Global Compact, with over 11,000 members globally, committed to business as a force for good. Now, as you've seen, we are still trying to join in our final panel member. So before introducing today's terrific lineup, it is my honor to introduce the co-chair of the UN Global Compact, Paul Polman, to formally open our session with introductory remarks. Now, Paul is well known to all as the former CEO of Unilever, whose leadership significantly increased the stock price, shareholder and stakeholder value through practical action on sustainability. He's absolutely an outstanding role model who has co-founded Imagine, and also serves as chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, as well as the co-chair of the United Nations Global Compact. Paul, over to you. Audio.
Climate change is an absolute priority and should be top of mind for business. This is also a huge intergenerational issue as well. In fact, the top 3 risks in the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Risk Report are all related to climate change. We have to take it seriously, engage, and act now. I'm seeing more and more businesses step up. I see science-based targets gaining traction. And I see new opportunities in addition to nature-based solutions, clean tech and innovation. Direct air capture of CO2 is now increasingly becoming a reality, not as an excuse to stop other emission reduction efforts, but as an additional opportunity to reach the Paris target on net zero emissions by 2050. But it takes a transformative mindset and leadership to capitalize on the opportunities the SDGs and climate solutions offer. I'm glad to see that so many global leaders are contributing to the ESG Competent Boards Certificate Program to help other board members, investors, executives, and their advisors. The program has proven to provide leaders with an inclusive and transformative mindset and an ability to resiliently deal with risks and capture the opportunities of a clean economy. I urge all leaders to stay informed and check out the global program that Competent Board offers. I understand that a few lucky leaders attending this event will receive the opportunity to participate in a Climate Competent Board session by Johan Rockström, Erika Karp, Curtis Ravenel, Peter Schlosser and myself, amongst others, are contributing. In my capacity as co-chair for the UN Global Compact, I'm delighted to introduce this session with competent boards and the new ASU Julie N. Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory to explore, in fact, the latest science on direct air capture, the trillion-dollar potential for business, and what kind of leadership it will take to make these bright opportunities into a valuable reality. Enjoy it to the fullest, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you, Paul. And to those of you who have just joined us, welcome and aloha from Hawaii. Paul, those are such relevant points, particularly about the current wildfires in both California and the Arctic, and COVID-19 being just a taste of what is yet to come if we don't address underlying causes. One scientist has even called COVID-19 a mere fire drill for climate change. As you said so well, Paul, climate change should be top of mind for business, both in terms of resiliently dealing with risks and to capture the opportunities of a clean economy. Transformative mindset and leadership, as you said, are paramount. We need to act now. So that's just such a great segue to our wonderful panel today. So I am thrilled to have with me Peter Schlosser, who is Vice President and Vice Provost of Global Futures at ASU, Hella Bank-Jorgensen, the founder and CEO of Competent Boards, Klaus Lochner, the Director of the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions at ASU, and Erica Karp, founder and CEO, Cornerstone Capital Group. Now, we know the global pandemic has thrown into stark relief two concepts that climate scientists have been warning about for decades now: interconnectedness and exponentiality. Now we all really understand them viscerally. As Grohal and Brundtland points out, no one is safe until we are all safe. And of course, existing inequalities are exacerbated. The exponential impacts are evident too. It took over 100 days for the first 1 million cases of COVID-19. Now it takes just a couple of days to add 1 million new cases. And globally, we're over 31 million and counting. So it's such an opportune moment to address both the short-term pandemic crisis and the underlying issue of the climate crisis, the transgression of planetary boundaries, as governments commit unprecedented sums, some 13 trillion, which is an average of 20% of global GDP, and here in the US, 25%. Peter Schlosser, the new ASU Julie N. Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, has as its guiding vision a future in which life thrives on a healthy planet and a commitment to shape tomorrow today. As Vice President and Vice Provost for this exciting new lab, co-chair of the Earth League, and one of the world's leading Earth scientists, you have been calling for rapid action at scale for many years now. Please help us understand just what is at stake. Why does business need to step up? And how much time do we really have left? Peter.
Thank you, Amanda. So as already has been said, we are dealing with severe issues on the climate front. But just to put that into context, it's actually not the only problem we are dealing with. It's one of many problems that have been caused by humankind putting many pressures on our planet to the point where we are asking our planet to give more than it actually has to offer. So now focusing in on climate in the midst of a state of shock that was brought upon us through COVID-19, I just want to lay out some of the fundamentals that define the task that we have ahead of us and the opportunity that comes with it. So if we are looking at the change in climate through the lens of the temperature, we are actually seeing that over the past, let's say, 2,000 years or so, temperature has changed from what you would call a natural state of variability, but also some sort of a more or less steady pace to a very rapid increase. Amanda called that the super exponentiality, and some people call that the hockey stick. But what has happened is that, especially from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have used so much energy drawn from burning of fossil fuels that the byproduct, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, increased very rapidly, quasi-exponentially, and with it, as we would expect, did the temperature. Temperature is not the only measure, and we all feel that. We have heat records, we feel them here in Phoenix, from which I'm reporting. We had the hottest summer, we had the hottest July, August, we have drought, and of course with it, in the entire Southwest, are coming severe wildfires. But not just here, it's not just local, regional. We see wildfires across the globe now. We see other effects, such as an increased number in this season of hurricanes. We are seeing disappearance of ice shields with the effect of rising sea level. So the effects are visible more frequently in more locations, and they express themselves in more fashions. So given that, of course, one has to ask the question, using the technologies that we will talk in a moment about to solve this problem, how much time do we have? And as has been laid out in the Paris Accord, but also in the IPCC 1.5 degree report, we really do not have a lot of time left. Just focus for a moment on the lower left graph here in this display. And what you can see is that emissions are increasing, still increasing up to now. In order to manage to get off the warming, we actually have to control the CO2 in the atmosphere. There are two components. One is to cut our emissions fast. You see that linear decrease from now to about a decade from now, 2030, and by then we have to cut it by about 50%. That is a very tall order, but it can be done. In addition, we also have to take back some of the CO2 we have put into the atmosphere. There are two methods. We either can capture it with chemical methods directly, we will talk about that here, or we can use nature and nature-based solutions, as they are called, to take another part out of it. So while we have created severe problems for ourselves on the climate front, in parallel to other problems, we also do not have to despair, because we do in principle know how to address these problems and how to solve them. And as Amanda already said, if there is one positive thing about COVID-19, it is that a lot of resources have been made available. If we are using them wisely, we actually can come out at a point that is better than the point we were at when COVID-19 started.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think that's a very positive note to be leaving everybody with. If we actually use these resources wisely, we can be better off. And the CEO of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, talks about building forward better, not building back, but building forward better. We really need to be making sure that we are using this 20% of GDP wisely. Hella Bank-Jorgensen, you are the CEO and founder of Competent Boards and a real international driver of both private sector action and innovation through your renowned accredited program for ESG, Environment and Social Governance Competent Boards. And as a current participant, I can say firsthand just what a valuable program it is. Thank you. As more companies shift from a shareholder to a broader stakeholder model and sign on to science-based targets and net zero emissions, the issue of carbon drawdown is also increasingly a material concern for boards. Tell us about your work on climate competent boards and why it is so important.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Amanda, and also thank you, Paul Pullman, for the shout out for competent boards. And I'm delighted to be working with you all on this very, very important topic. I think I do not need to explain why climate competent boards are so important to this audience. I think I'm talking to the converted. You can let me know in the chat if I'm correct or not. But we all know that the tone at the top is essential for change really to stick. And we all know that change only happens when we fully understand the consequences of not changing. And I think that is where ESG and climate competent boards comes in. The board of directors are tasked with oversight. And that is very difficult if you don't have the insight or the foresight to really understand the subject matter. I've been blessed by working with global leaders as Paul Pullman and board members, and many of them know, well, I guess we now over 95 global leaders that are sharing their insight, experience, and thoughts with other board members and potential board members, and as well as executives and investors. So I think many of these leaders know that unless they have the insight, it's very difficult to make informed decisions. And we need right now people to make informed decisions. We need right now leaders, in my mind, all over the world to understand, but not only to understand, I think we need people to act. So let me give you a few examples from the leaders that are sharing their insight in the program. One of them is Chad Holliday, who is the chair of Shell. He and his board are educating themselves. And well, I guess you all seen also in the news in terms of the things that they're doing. Another leader contributing to the program is the chair of Ørsted, Thomas Thune Andersen. And I had the pleasure of working with Ørsted during the first years of the transformation to now the world's most sustainable company. And I think both of them and all the other leaders will say it is about insight, but it's also about courage. It's about putting policies, procedures, goals, and ambitions behind the words. It's also about capturing the opportunities, as Peter, you were saying. And I can tell you that those boards who are educated, they are looking with huge interest in the opportunities. And that includes, as Paul Pullman was saying, carbon drawdown, including also, of course, and I think we need to also very much look at that, all the nature-based solutions, direct air capture, etc. Amanda, perhaps I should leave it there.
Thank you so much, Hella. And I think for me, as a boring old economist, I always focus on the numbers. And I've been fascinated to see that for those companies where board oversight of climate change as a material issue are 9 times more likely to set emission reduction targets. So I think it does show us how important the work that you are doing to really raise awareness of these issues. And as Peter pointed out, we have very little time left. I think the latest data is something like 8 years of carbon budget. And I'm seeing in the chat, everybody is very aware we really need to be acting, and we need business to be stepping to the forefront. And it's exciting to see now that over half companies globally, in terms of market cap, are actually disclosing on climate. Now, the bad news, of course, is the other half isn't yet, but we are making progress, which is so encouraging. Now, I am delighted to introduce Klaus Lochner, who is a true pioneer and one with a very practical technology to help save our planet. Klaus, you're Professor of Sustainable Engineering and Director of the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions at ASU. And you have the distinction of being the first to actually suggest the artificial capture of carbon dioxide from the air over 20 years ago. You were also the lead author on the IPCC report on carbon capture and storage. So I know that you and Peter worked closely together at the Earth Institute at Columbia, and together you have engaged private sector investors now to help close the carbon cycle through direct air capture, to be able to sequester carbon and hopefully to be able to go to scale, given the trajectory and the timeframes that Peter set out. Now, for an economist like me, one big issue is cost structures. But you also point out that nobody predicted the massive drop in the cost of solar voltaics, which are now among the cheapest for energy. So tell us about direct air capture and why it is a $1 trillion opportunity for business. Klaus, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I sort of believe I'm talking to the converted if I'm talking about climate change. I'm not so sure I'm talking to the converted when it comes to look for direct solution. I come at it not as a climate scientist, I'm a consumer of climate science. I come at it as an engineer. From my perspective, the biggest problem we have out there is CO2, which is mainly the result of combusting fossil fuels, which we dig up from underground and put into the atmosphere. It is the dominant greenhouse gas, and in 1980, we actually had a choice. We could have, in 1980, said, let's phase out fossil fuels, move over to non-fossil energy resources, and by 2000, we would have ended up a little above 350 ppm, and things would have been nice and stable. We didn't make that choice. We instead kept going. Now we are actually limited to thinking of it as a waste management problem, and we have put so much litter into the atmosphere, we are now at 415 parts per million, that we actually have to figure out how to get a fraction of it back. And keep in mind, the energy system has a large amount of inertia. Even if we try tomorrow morning to stop emitting, it'll take us a decade or two to actually complete that job. By that time, we have overshot the 1.5, and unless we are very careful, we will overshoot the 2-degree target. So bottom line is we need to start thinking about this as putting carbon dioxide back away. And of course, we can use nature to help us with that. We can grow trees. And people have suggested we should grow 1 trillion trees and maybe we then get there. I would like to point out that we have about 600 gigatons of carbon in trees, and we add in biomass in general, and we add about 10 gigatons a year. I believe at the end of the day, this is helping us, it will get us started, but we will need mechanical trees, artificial trees, trees which do direct air capture, which are simply designed to do things, and by the way, can theoretically at least do this 1,000 times faster and with 1,000 times smaller footprint. So you're now talking not about 1 trillion trees, you're talking about 1 billion trees. And you see one prototype, which is actually going to be built on the ASU campus in the next coming months and years. You will see us demonstrating the technology. We are working with a startup company, a European-American company, who is building out a business around the idea of doing this. There's a fantastic business opportunity as you think about it. This tree, about 10 meters tall, 1.50 meters wide when it's fully extended, is like a small tree. It is 1,000 times faster at collecting CO2, and it would collect roughly 80 kilograms of CO2 a day, which for the average world is about a small family of people who put out that much CO2 in the US. It's 2 people who would need 1 tree. So that sets the scale of all of them. We will need clearly a lot of them, as I just indicated, on the order of 1 trillion. They could make CO2 for sequestration. This is the waste disposal. We need to get back down from the 450 we will get to and come maybe back down to 400 or 350, which will keep us busy for 40, 50 years. And then on the backside, we can take advantage of this revolution which happened in the photovoltaic sector and also come down the learning curve. If you go out,
seem to have a little problem with Klaus' audio, so while we try to get him back, just a very interesting comment in the chat from Igor Bobek, who's asking, what are the top obstacles for reducing carbon emission? We have our fabulous finance expert here, Erica Karp, who will be speaking later. But Erica points out that systemic financial risk and intersectional analysis are actually key. And when we look at some of the latest data from the Carbon Disclosure Project, we're seeing that companies are reporting over $1 trillion of risk at the moment. And of course, we're at 420 parts per million. I live here in Hawaii, which is near Mauna Kea, and that's where some of those some of the data comes from. So interestingly, we're also seeing very obviously sea level rise here. So for me, it's a total reality, as it is for many islands around the world. And the idea of mechanical trees as well as our nature-based solutions is so positive when we're looking at this trajectory that Peter set out. So hopefully we will get Klaus back soon. But in the meantime, I would love to move on to Erica Karp, founder and CEO of Cornerstone Capital. Erica, you have such an impressive track record in finance, having been head of global sector research at UBS Investment Bank. And as an economist and former banker myself, I was so impressed to hear you speak at Climate Competent Boards about why it is critical to promote a more regenerative and inclusive form of capitalism. And we're seeing that in the chat where people are saying, you know, part of the problem is this attitude that we have where we're using up the planet's resources. And as Peter pointed out, we're using them up to the extent where the planet can no longer support that. So despite the commitments of governments to the UN SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, and as former ambassador to the UN, it bothers me so much that the IMF is estimating over $5 trillion still being spent on direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies. And latest data we have is 2017. So Erica, please tell us, why is carbon drawdown becoming such a critical issue for the finance sector and for investors? Erica, you need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry about that. After 12,000, webinars, you'd think I would figure it out. So I think the main thing that the world needs to understand is the systemic financial risk associated with climate change. So think about it. We might be seeing $5 trillion of investment in old economy fuels, but that is costing us something on the order of $24 trillion in value. That's what it's costing us. And that analysis thinks about the interrelationships and again, the systemic financial risk. And I've posted a little piece of research on the chat to look at that. But here's the issue. If a board of directors think, oh, I'm not in an industry that, where climate change matters, well, think again. Because the reality is when we see all the object lessons of raging fires, and raging waters, and human migrations, and health risks and pandemics, and this is just the start of it, right? So the physical damage that we can see, well, think about it. Those physical assets very often are representing collateral for loans by financial institutions. And if those assets are damaged, well, the financial institutions are going to take write-downs and they're going to increase their lending costs. And then what you're going to see is the household sector not having access to capital. And then you'll see the consumer sector of the global economy, which, by the way, in the US is 2/3 of the economy. You'll see consumers stop spending, right? And that affects every industry. So, I mean, people, again, boards need to understand that this does affect their economics and their profitability. So again, that systemic financial risk is huge. So that's one thing. Now, think about the money that needs to go towards addressing climate and addressing, frankly, all of the sustainable development goals. So I think Bloomberg would tell us their number was that last year and the year before, there was about $500 million $500 billion spent on alternative energies. Well, the numbers, I believe, say that actually it has to be about 1.5 trillion that needs to be spent to address the climate issues now, the sciences that we're talking about. So what's being invested now is still a drop in the bucket, right? If we're going to deal with both the climate issues and the financial issues, all right? So the job of the financial services industry is to get money moving. And the issue is it can't just come from the public sector, it can't just come from the government. The money from the private sector, trillions and trillions, need to start moving to climate solutions. And by the way, let's say we talk about 1.5 trillion for climate issues. Well, what about issues of gender? What about issues of health? What about issues of everything from broadband to education, all of these things? We're talking about 6 or 7 trillion a year. That's the kind of spending we need to address the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, what I would say about the SDGs, we know they were not really developed just for investors, certainly, or just for corporations. They were developed for everyone. And so these 17 goals, I would tell you that each one, in and of themselves, are uninvestable. They're too big, right? So what we need to do is find a pragmatic way to make the SDGs accessible, to make them investable. And so we would argue at Cornerstone that the single common denominator among those 17 Sustainable Development Goals is access. Access is what we need, and access gives us a way to move forward. So for instance, let's say we want access to women's economic empowerment, SDG 5, right? Well, yeah, that's the one, half the world's population and then some, and way more than half the world's brilliance. But anyway, let's say we take SDG 5. Well, we're not going to get access to women's economic empowerment until we get access to water, and to healthcare, and to broadband, and to capital, and to education, right? Each one of those SDGs, to get access to them, you need access to multiple other SDGs. Everything is related. Everything is a system. In fact, I was thinking a few months ago that I wasn't hearing enough about the intersection of climate and health, right? These are massive. Okay, so when we think about that intersection, I said to one of my scientist friends, Sir David King, by the way, we're going to have Sir David on a call later this week. But I said, so isn't COVID, related to climate? And he said, well, it's not that direct. I'm like, wait a second, maybe it is that direct. If people are, using nature's resources too much, and the animals are getting closer to the humans, and the animals are 60% of the cause of human viruses and pandemics, isn't it obvious that COVID and climate are, And he looked at me and he said, well, I guess simply speaking, yes. So I think, yes. So we have so much to do. We have so much money to move. And the idea of the systematic analysis of environmental, social, and governance factors, the systematic analysis of ESG, that is a discipline. It's not ideological, it's not political, it's not divisive, it is an investment discipline. And so every board needs to understand what an ESG analysis of their company is going to look like. And then investors who want to do impact investing, sustainable investing, values-based investing, whatever you want to call it, it is an analytical discipline that must be applied to 100% of financial investments.
Thank you so much, Erica. Systemic financial risks is so key. And it was fascinating for me looking at some recent research from the Carbon Disclosure Project that in fact now over 525 investors with $96 trillion in assets are requesting information on climate change. So we are beginning to see a sea change, at least with investors, which should be a clarion call to the private sector to step up and recognize that with that interest, they do need to be doing that disciplined work, as you point out. Thank you too for answering Prof. Rohit Kumar's question about the integrated nature of the SDGs. And as an ambassador who helped to negotiate them at the time, I'm thrilled that you, as a private sector person, get that intersectionality. And of course, also thrilled to hear you talk about SDG 5, which is so critical. Here we are in 2020, gender equality has not been achieved in any country, and only 8 countries even legislate it. So we do have a lot of work to do on all of the SDGs, and I'm loving seeing these fabulous comments in the chat from the audience. Now, I am thrilled that we have a question from Bruno Sada as we open up the floor. Bruno is the CEO for North America for CDP, the Climate Disclosure Project, and is just tremendous. He is also adjunct faculty at ASU. And Bruno, I know that you have a question that you would like to ask of our panelists. If you are able to turn on your video and unmute, the floor will be yours. So Bruno, welcome.
Thanks, Amanda. Can you hear me? All right. Well, hi everyone, and yeah, great, great conversation. I mean, all these interconnection points, right? What does the world need? What does the science tell us? What does the financial markets both need, but also can do to help? I guess my question, and you mentioned it earlier in your comments, Amanda, about this, how the rapid decrease in the price of solar PV, was so instrumental in the acceleration of renewable energy. My question is really, as we see now many businesses, cities, states, regions, even countries making net zero commitments, usually by 2050, all understanding that this will require clearly a lot of emission reductions, but that not all emissions will be reduced. And I think to Klaus's point earlier, that we need to go faster maybe than that. Thinking back to, again, all the ways that we were able to create financing mechanisms, markets, demand signals to really accelerate the growth of renewable energy, what is the analog for this concept of carbon removal, carbon drawdown? Both what signals does to organizations like Klaus's need from the market, and what does the market need from the technology readiness space to start creating these interfaces to create, again, both the demand, the access, as Erica talks about, and the financing and mechanisms to really accelerate this process.
A question for Erica. Erica, floor is yours.
I have to admit, there was a lot in there that you said, Bruno. Can you, again, from the financial standpoint, can you net out the questions? I make sure I get it right. And I'm wondering.
Sure. Yeah, I think the question was probably, there was a little bit for everybody in there. I guess for you, Erica, this idea of, how, ultimately we saw this rapid increase in capital flows into clean energy when, we were able to create market instruments and market interfaces, anything from PPAs to other kinds of things, and policy instruments like the IPC and PTC. What do you think needs to happen to again enable and accelerate this carbon drawdown and really accelerate capital flows into this space of carbon removal and carbon drawdown?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I'm not an expert on these issues in product creation, so I'm more of a generalist. But what I would suggest is that it's been a while since people have started making money, okay, on these ideas. I mean, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, all you saw for private investors were losses, right? And pretty dramatic ones in many cases. So now I think we're at a place where we can start seeing money be made, all right? And face it, I mean, money flows where money is, right? So what I think is that we've started to see kind of guarantees, first loss type guarantees, which are getting catalytic money flowing, and that's great. And so I think generally speaking, what we need to see is a larger extent of that. We need to see the government spending underwriting, basically, spending on alternatives. So, you know, that's as much as I can really get to. But specifically, in terms of what we would call impact investing, we are seeing more and more funds, more and more opportunities. And again, it's got to be that catalytic capital, hopefully with a little risk underwriting. So what I would do is I can turn you on to a lot of experts doing this kind of work. One of our board members, Ibrahim Al-Husseini, has an organization called Full Cycle. And this is what we're trying to see. He's trying to de-risk investments in alternative energies. But certainly, Bruno, I can find lots of resources for you.
Thanks so much, Erica. And I think it's fascinating listening to Klaus, who we hope will be back on soon, when he talks about the incredible precipitous drop in the cost of photovoltaics. Nobody thought we were going to end up being able to generate at 1 or 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And that technological curve has, in fact, made an enormous difference. Renewables are way cheaper than fossil fuels now. And that's what we're not realizing. Without these massive subsidies, fossil fuels would not be economic. And Erica pointed out this incredible $24 trillion of all the adjunct issues relating to it, health, etc. So this is something we need to be thinking about from a very disciplined perspective. Bruno, I know it was fascinating to see that we've got over half of companies now actually disclosing to CDP, because companies are recognizing how important this issue is. That's definitely a step in the right direction, but we need the other half to be doing it too. So I would like to move next to Peter Schlosser and then next to Hella to comment on Bruno's very comprehensive question. Peter, would you like to comment on the point about the costs and how those may come down in future years?
Yeah, Bruno raised an interesting question of this interaction of technology and the financing. And I wanted to take two dimensions of that. One is, when was the technology ready and when did we see to start investment? As you pointed out, Amanda, Klaus's idea was before 2000. He produced in a pilot experiment pure CO2 using that technology in the early 2000s. And at that point, if we would have been ready to finance an upscaling, we would be 1.5 decades ahead in that technology. But it was virtually impossible to get the kind of investment, which in the grand scheme, we are talking here about trillions and trillions. The first steps would have been a few 10 million to a few 100 millions to actually get that thing going to the next step, and from there then to the next, etc. So there was a hesitancy to take what was perceived a high risk investing into these new technologies. The other one is cost, because that sometimes was used as a quote-unquote excuse. At the beginning, the estimates of what would it cost to extract 1 ton of CO2 back from the atmosphere varied widely, up to typically between $500 and $1,000 per ton. There are still estimates out there that are pretty high, in the hundreds of dollars. If you look at Klaus's technology, the technologies of the other companies that are trying to do a similar upscale of that direct air capture, I think we can confidently say that with the growth of that industry, that the cost will go to $100, possibly $30 a ton. So there will be a major decrease in the cost, and there is no reason to believe that this will not happen. There's certainly some uncertainty when exactly will happen, how fast it will happen, but I would expect that in short order, we will get to a cost that is commercially competitive, which means that the CO2 extracted from the atmosphere will be at the cost or cheaper than the CO2 that's presently produced for commercial use. So there are clearly, the messages are, we missed the opportunity to get early into that business about 1.5 decades ago. We are still struggling with it in terms of investing at the right scale. But the uncertainty about cost, I think, is probably, there's too big a point made out of it if people believe in well-proven trajectories of how these upscalings work. We all would expect that the one cornerstone for price point will be around $100, and at that point it is commercially viable.
Thank you so much, Peter. And it's interesting to see that trajectory of new technology, and then as more into the market, seeing the costs come down significantly. And of course, with the trajectory you set out, we really need to be going with these proven technologies and seeing how we can make a difference. And we have Klaus back. So Heather, we'll move to you forward while Klaus has a moment to gather his thoughts. And Klaus, I will be moving to you next about this price trajectory and how we can really go to scale with direct air capture technology. Hella, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, there are several observations. One is, you noticed we try to stay small. Can you hear me?
Yes.
One observation is that mass manufactured technologies tend to get cheaper as you do more of them. There's a rough rule of thumb that at least successful technologies reduce their costs somewhere between 15 and 20% in every cycle. And of course, there's a limit how low you can go. But photovoltaics in this process got 100 times cheaper than it was at the start, and wind roughly 40, 50 times cheaper than it was at the start. So like in the 1960s. And so therefore, it is reasonable to assume that until you have evidence to the contrary, that direct air capture will also follow trajectories like that. And if you ask how much do we do right now, we do kilotons. If you go to megatons, which is commercial markets for CO2, this is what you do to fill fire extinguishers and make fizzy drinks. At that scale, you would be roughly 1,000 times bigger than the DAC community is today. And you would therefore predict a 5 to 10 times lower price if things follow the trajectory you have